going to be talking about supporting the military family, including our military spouses. She is the military spouse liaison at Washington Department of Veteran Affairs. She's a spouse of the system, and so she knows what it's like to be a military spouse. So she's got a pretty lengthy presentation here. So and I know that she's the type of person that loves to get interrupted with questions. So any vet corps members that are here today? Okay.
I already turned my thing in, so I don't need to.
All right. Olivia, it's all yours.
Okay. So, as Seth mentioned, I am a military spouse. We're going to talk about what that means in a minute. My service member was active duty Navy for 27 years and retired in 2019. We've been married 20 years this past June. But I'm also a military child. I had dual military parents, and my connection to Washington State, my husband was stationed at Naval Station Everett, Naval Air Station Whidbey Island, Naval Base Kitsap, and my parents were stationed at JBLM before it was JBLM, it was Fort. So sort of have a breadth of experience across the state. Prior to taking this position as a military spouse liaison, I worked for Operation Homefront and the American Red Cross that served the military community. And I did program delivery across the state of Washington. So while I never lived at Fairchild and in the Spokane community, I did program delivery there in my work professional roles. So I'm assuming that you have heard the mission and vision of the Washington State Department of Veterans Affairs at some point today. But if you haven't, this conference is named Serving Those Who Serve, which is the mission of the Washington State Department of Veterans Affairs. And our vision is that all Washington veterans and their families are connected to their earned benefit. I'm seated within the Department of Veterans Affairs, so I think it's really important that I tell you what our mission and vision is. Within the Washington State Department of Veterans Affairs is the Washington State Military Transition and Readiness Council. The Washington State Military Transition and Readiness Council focuses on employment, the National Guard Reserve, apprenticeship, higher education, and entrepreneurship within the military community, focusing on transitioning service members. We also work with military spouse employment and credential portability, which is where I come in. And this is me, and the Military Spouse Initiative within the WDBA. So we talked about my slides look weird. They did not look like this whenever I submitted them. Some things happened. Just forgive that. We'll figure it out in another iteration. But we talked about the mission is serving those who served at WDBA. And the mission of the Military Spouse Initiative is serving those who served by serving military spouses. So how did that come to be? In 2019, the Washington State Department of Veterans Affairs and the Employment Security Department conducted a series of listening sessions with military spouses at every installation in Washington State, every major military installation. Those military spouses shared a variety of issues that they're facing and concerns that they have, and a readout report was shared from those listening sessions with the Washington State Legislature. In 2020, they created legislation creating my position, the military spouse liaison. Washington is the first state in the United States to have a military spouse liaison. The legislation creating my role has me focused on reducing and removing employment barriers for military spouses, connecting them to resources, and also addressing the childcare concern for military families in the state of Washington. So that's how the initiative came to be. We have another state since my position was created. Virginia has also enacted similar legislation to have a military spouse liaison as well. And then our vision for the Military Spouse Initiative is that every military spouse in the state of Washington is empowered and supported on their journey to fulfilling their needs and finding meaningful employment. And our vision is focused on fulfilling their needs, not just on employment, because some military spouses are not going to work on this assignment. We also have veteran spouses that we serve through this initiative as well. So we have a broad range of military spouses that we're serving in this through this work. So in this time that we're sitting here together getting to know each other so well, we're going to focus on 4 things. One is understanding the military spouse and family culture. Part of that is just knowing what is a military spouse. So everybody has sort of a different opinion of that. The second is marketing to military spouses and family members, and you may not consider what you do marketing, but communicating is part of marketing. So however you're reaching out to this population. Recognizing the needs of military spouses, and you'll notice on that third bullet, it just says military spouses and it doesn't say family members. We're going to talk more about that when we get to that section. The reason for that is military spouses tend to be the channel and the gateway to the rest of the family, mostly the children. So by recognizing their needs, you're recognizing the needs of the children and the families. And then connecting military spouses and family members to appropriate resources. And there's a big part of that connection to resource that is the work that all of us are doing. And so we're going to talk more in this presentation about the reluctance to ask for help in this community, the veteran community, and the military connected community. And so anyone who is servicing this community can be an entry point to the next set of resources. And how we can really do that with and maintain a honest and a collaborative relationship with the person that we're providing service to. So understanding the culture. Service member definitions. I like to start from the beginning. Sometimes we're not all on the same page. Active duty, National Guard, and Reserve are all different aspects of the military. To avoid the term active duty, I will sometimes say actively serving so that it encompasses National Guard and Reserve members. If we say military, we say service member, sometimes people feel excluded. So we just want to be aware of these different definitions and who those definitions encompass. Who you think the definition encompasses may not be who the person you're providing service to believes it encompasses. When I say actively serving, there are probably National Guard and Reserve members who think that means active duty and excludes them. So whatever term you choose to use for your program and delivery service, make sure that underneath that term, you're defining it so people know. And why are we starting with the service members? We're talking about spouses and family. Well, we're starting with the service member because does anybody know what every military spouse has in common?
Service.
What do they have in common?
A service member.
A service member.
Yep.
What is the one thing that every military spouse has in common is who they chose to marry. So we have to define who they chose to marry so we know what they're eligible for through your program delivery, if they're eligible for something. So we have to start here because this is what they all have in common. Now the other part of it is I consider myself a military spouse. I'm a military spouse, but my spouse is not active duty anymore. He is a veteran now, he's retired. But I still call myself a military spouse. So military spouse, in my universe, that includes spouses of actively serving service members and veterans. That's what that means to me. It might mean something different to you, and it might mean something different to the person you're providing service to. But it's important that we note that. Now, veterans often will self-exclude themselves for a variety of reasons. They aren't retirees. They didn't serve 20. They didn't see combat. They only served a couple years. So for some reason, they will self-exclude from the veteran conversation. So it's important when you're providing service to veteran spouses or veterans that you define what that means for your program. Because in this room, if I were to ask you what's a military spouse, what's a veteran, what's a service member, you might come up with each of you a totally different set of definitions. So we all just needing to make sure we're on the same page. Now, the veterans, the dictionary.com definition of veteran says especially one who has fought in a war. That's not the definition of a veteran to me. So that's why it's really important from the very beginning, define who is eligible and communicate who is eligible. So who are military spouses and children? I just sort of gave you a preview of the slide because I said I consider myself a military spouse. Your program might only be open to military spouses of active duty or actively serving, Maybe it's only open to military spouses of veterans. That's okay, but just define it. Because again, these terms mean different things to different people. So there's not one formal definition of military spouse. It can be active duty, National Guard, reservist, veteran, retiree, caregiver spouses, and then and on and on. I mean, there's Navy spouses, there's Marine Corps spouses, disabled veteran spouses, and then you have military children. Military children also includes children of veterans and actively serving service members. So some programs, though, are not open to both sides of the house for the veterans and the actively serving. And we also have Gold Star families, spouses, and others. Traditionally, that's who died while serving in the U.S. military, but again, some people have a different definition of that term as well. Not saying one's right or wrong. Hiring Our Heroes defines military spouse program eligibility as a current or previous military spouse of a veteran or military service member. I like that definition. As a retiree spouse, my impact from being a spouse of an active duty service member is felt now. My career was impacted. It stopped being impacted when my husband got out. I'm still impacted by that. My resume is still funky. So allowing me to use the term military spouse my whole life is important. It doesn't get me any benefits. I don't get anything because I call myself a military spouse. I don't have any hiring preference because it's not active duty anymore. But I believe that I belong still to this community. It matters to me to have that term. Any questions so far on definitions? Okay, we're going to keep moving on. So Washington state population. I like to talk about population because sometimes in this conversation, people say, well, I serve veterans. This is who I serve. I serve veterans. But population matters because there's an awful lot of spouses and children of veterans and actively serving and National Guard and Reserve service members in Washington state. So some of these numbers are extrapolated and estimated, particularly for veterans. It's really hard to know how many spouses and children of veterans there are. But the Department of Defense does an excellent job of providing us with demographic data. So we can drill down to our state to see exactly how many there are. So there's 57,645 active duty service members in the state of Washington, 28,483 active duty spouses, and 43,111 active duty children. Now, I have to add a note here is that some children do not live with their sponsor. Some spouses don't live with their sponsor. So these numbers aren't perfect, but they're pretty accurate. We also have Reserve and National Guard numbers that are pretty solid as well. I like to keep these numbers separated because the difference for an active duty lifestyle is very different from a Reserve and National Guard lifestyle. And so understanding those separations between the two populations is important. We'll talk about that in a minute when we talk about the needs of the community, but that's why I separate out these numbers. The one thing that I don't have here is the children that are adult children of the veteran population. Because adult children can be impacted by their parents' service, and we don't track that. So if I'm an adult child of two veterans, and yeah, I'm certainly impacted. I didn't live in one place. I have no roots. My friends grew up in Washington state and have lived here since birth. I don't have that background. Moved around all the time as a military kid. And other issues with, PTSD and trauma from being in the military as a military child, that was part of my life. But no one accounts for me in that capacity. So we know that we're serving these people. We're also serving some other people that are unaccounted for too, because they're adults, they're kind of off the grid. So this is a graphical representation of why it matters that you're here and how much I appreciate you. So we have service members and veterans is this column. And it's divided up, you probably can't tell very well, but the bottom section is veterans. There's a lot more veterans than active duty and National Guard Reserve. The middle dark red is active duty, and that top like dark blue is reserve and guard. So this is our military and veteran population in Washington. These are military spouses of that population. Military children here. When we combine military spouses and children, there's more than there are of the veterans and the active duty and the National Guard and Reserve. There's more than the service member or the veteran side. And yet, we're kind of an afterthought. We're sort of, you're also welcome. Or spouses can come too. Or, make sure to add a place for them to check themselves off as a box. But there's more of us. And this is something I'm pretty committed to talking about because there's a lot of people that have been impacted by the service that are kind of considered extra as a program delivery. There's a lot of, I mentioned there's a lot of demographic information, and I put these in the slides and you can access it later if this kind of in-depth deep dive of data matters to you. This looks like it's me jazz, but maybe not everybody. Important on this slide, though, the most important thing is active duty members with children, 37.6%. And this is just in Washington. Every state, because of the kind of mission that the different bases have, has a slightly different demographic representation for their military. But our active duty in Washington, 37.6% have children. And when we examine military families of actively serving, so National Guard, Reserve, and active duty, there's a couple of considerations that are important. One is single with children. So is it a service member who has children and doesn't have a spouse? Then the other is married to a civilian with children. I mean, the spouses matters too, but from the children's perspective, married to a civilian with children. And then the dual military with children. Those are all really important distinctions for the population that deserve additional conversation and consideration. They all have different needs. You can also look at the demographics for selected reserve families. That's National Guard and reservists. They have a higher percentage of having children in those families. 43.6% of National Guard and reserve families in Washington have children. Spouses. 91.7% of spouses in Washington of active duty are women. So that's important to note. Primarily when we talk overall demographics, female is the leading gender. And then 31.1 years. So they tend to skew young for active duty. For reserve families, again, the number is a little bit different. 83% female, 36.4%. 36.4 is the average age. From an age perspective, in the active duty column for children, most children are 0 to 11 for active duty families. The highest group is 0 to 5, 44.8%. That matters. Why does that matter? Well, active duty families tend to be a little bit younger than selected reserve families, and obviously than veteran families. So their kids are a little bit younger. That means they need childcare. So that's a big consideration. For the selected reserve, their largest category is the 6 to 11, school age. Childcare is a little bit less of a primary issue for the selected reserve population. Still important. There's still a lot of kids in this category. And then dependents. This is again just kind of more breakdown. I won't go into that in much detail. Army. These are the total children by branch. So Army, we have the largest Army population in Washington than the other branches. 23,043 Army children in the state of Washington. And you can see the breakdowns for the other branches as well. And then by year. So I think this is sort of an expansion of that conversation on the average age. So 7.4 is the active duty average age, 9.4 is the selected reserve average age. So again, when we're talking about serving the community and understanding their needs, knowing what age the average child is impacts the family, and that can help us with service delivery. Employment is a huge issue for military spouses. And I love this chart because it kind of breaks down the civilian employment rate. This is selected reserve on this chart, and this is active duty on this one. The this bottom row is seeking work. So they're unemployed, but they want to be employed. And then, so you can see it's 15% for Army, and it averages in the 13 to 15% for active duty. For the selected reserve, it's much lower. So we have 3% for Air National Guard, 9% for Army Reserve. Why is that a big deal? That is a big deal because selected reserve don't move. So it's not deployment, and it's not just being a military spouse that makes you not work. What makes you not work is that you move. And it's difficult to find employment when you have to move every 2 to 3 years. So the difference is that they move. They're not in one place, and they don't have to have PCS orders all the time. So this is the meat right here of our presentation. We're going to break down the population for the actively serving family and the veteran family. These are my bullets. And important considerations. So number 1, actively serving families' life and work are strongly connected for the service member, which impacts the family. So they kind of own you. You're on call 24/7 if you're a service member. That doesn't just affect the service member, it affects the family. The military determines where you live. Those PCS orders, having to move, not being able to have consistent employment, that's part of the military owning you, dictating your life, but telling you where you're going to go. That has a trickle-down effect on the family. Not all active duty families live on an installation or in base housing, and base housing may not be on base. Military housing sometimes is off the installation in the community. Frequent moves, approximately every 2 to 3 years. Military families move 14% more often than a civilian family does. Those moves have massive impact. They have impact on making roots, having family friends, making connections so that you can find employment. So much far-reaching impact. Prolonged and multiple deployments. Service members can be different when they come home. We all know this. You know this from the work that you already are doing, but that has an impact on the children and on the spouses as well. And there are even studies that deployments impact the health of the military family. We see mental health impacts, particularly for teenagers that are children of service members. We see some correlation with potential suicide risk, not necessarily attempts, but consideration from self-reporting for the military spouse and child population, and other health habits and impacts that are tied with when the service member is deployed. Many military families don't live with their service member sponsor. Some of this is related to divorce or separations within military families. Some of it's related to geo-batching. The service member may choose to go to the assignment and leave the family behind because of the spouse's work or how the children are doing in school or what grade they are. The housing market has a factor in that. But having those separations is very challenging for the military family. Military spouses are highly educated. So this is part of knowing who the population is. 84% have some college, 25% have a bachelor's degree, and 10% have an advanced degree. 65% of military family members volunteer in their community, and despite that, many feel disconnected from the civilian community. So they're doing the work, they're volunteering to help the communities improve and grow and be more to thrive, but yet they don't feel connected. Financial insecurity and basic needs security are significant stressors, particularly in Washington State. We have a lot of families that are struggling with housing. We have a lot of families that are struggling to get food, having to go to food pantries. There's a lot of reasons for that. Our BAH rate for our actively serving service members, a lot of people think that that isn't really reflected in the cost of living in Washington State for some of our bases. The housing market is really challenging. Some people think that if you're a military family, you get a house on base. You do not. You get on a wait list for a house on base. Some families get their house 2 years after they put their name on the wait list in Washington. And the housing market around the installation isn't necessarily affordable for a military family. So that's part of the impact. Childcare. Finding yourself on the wait list as a military family, you have to get on a wait list every 2 to 3 years and start that search over. There is childcare on base, but again, sometimes you put your name on the wait list when you arrive at the installation, and you get your call up right as you're ready to go. We hear from dual military families or single military families with children that are literally bringing their children to work armed because their job requires them to have a weapon, and they have their child in their child carrier, their car seat, taking them to the office because they don't have anywhere to take them. So childcare is a significant impact, and if that impacts the military family and they can't find childcare, that means the spouse probably isn't able to work. So all of that leads to financial instability and basic needs insecurity. And then, I just talked about childcare options, so that's perfect, I just said that. The culture may foster a reluctance to seek help or disclose military affiliation. So we talk about this all the time within the veteran community, that they don't like to ask for help. That trickles over to the family, trickles over to the spouses, and it impacts the children as well. That philosophy of not asking for help. So there's a lot of resources, but it's really difficult to get military families to plug in because of that reluctance. I hear from spouses that say, I think that if I ask for help, it's going to affect his career. His command will find out. Even from civilian or state providers, there's still that worry. So there's a lot of stigma between seeking the help that may be offered, certainly at the installation level as well. And then we have chronic underemployment and unemployment. I talked about those percentages, but military spouses who are not in the percentage of unemployed, when they do find a job, it tends to be at a lower level than what they should be eligible for, because they have to compromise. I've done it myself. You just want to kind of keep some employment, have some kind of work history that's consistent. But knowing you're going to move, or knowing you don't have good childcare options, you have to compromise. Where the civilian community doesn't have to do that as often. And then the final point is military spouses are a diverse group requiring multidimensional engagement efforts. I asked you earlier, what is the one common thread for military spouses? Who they married. That's the thing that they have in common. They don't have much in common after that. And that's a really unpopular thing to say. We move around a lot. We're resilient for being able to move. We don't have the commonality that veterans have in our training, our uniform, our appearance, leadership skills, teamwork. Military spouses don't have a common work history the way veterans do. So lumping them together with veterans and how you're going to provide service and how you're selling them to potential employers or service providers, that's a mistake because they don't have that. They have a lot of great qualities. I am a military spouse, don't get me wrong, we're amazing. But we don't have that same commonality that veterans do. And approaching military spouses with the same approach that you do with veterans from a service delivery perspective, that's not going to work. These are civilians. These are civilians that are military connected, but they are civilians. So that is actively serving military families. I have a similar slide on veterans. Before we dive into that, I want to ask some questions. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to talk about that move every 2 to 3 years. You know, on the top 10 list of most stressful events in your life, the move is number 4.
Yeah.
And having to do it every 2 to 3 years. And about every 2 to 3 moves is about what we kind of coined is about the equivalent of a house fire. As much stuff gets broken, and when you move stuff, your valuables, heirlooms, it doesn't matter if you allowed the military to hire a contractor to pack up your house, or if you pack it up yourself, just stuff just gets destroyed and moves. And it being just such a stressful event anyways, and then having to repeat it every 2 to 3 years, it just compounds it. So
a lot of stress involved. And the other aspect, and I'm glad you're mentioning that, is part of the financial security conversation. As a civilian, or as someone who isn't in this sector, it's very challenging for people to understand what it would be like every 2 to 3 years not to have a paycheck for 2 to 3 months. Because that's how long it takes military spouses to make the move, get to the new place, find out where they're going to live so they can find the job. Because you don't want to live 45 minutes or an hour from where you're going to work. And then get their next paycheck from when they leave. So most people are not in a situation where they can go 3 months without a paycheck. And yet, that's what military spouses have to do if they're able to get work at all. So that's part of that moving stress as well. It makes it very challenging to be successful and thrive as a military family. And people ask me sometimes, why are you in the Department of Veterans Affairs? You're serving actively serving spouses primarily is your focus. Then why are you seated within WDVA? The best way to make sure that we have successful veteran families is to make sure that we have successful military families. If a military family thrives emotionally, mentally, physically, financially, they will more likely thrive as a veteran family. So we can't let them fall through the cracks prior to transition. Transition gets a lot of attention. That's an important time for a military family. But it's really important that we pay attention when they're actively serving. And this isn't the responsibility alone of the Department of Defense and the military branch. We as communities and state agencies have to take on some of this responsibility of ensuring our active duty National Guard and Reserve families are thriving. It's our responsibility too. So let me ask you a couple questions before we move on to the next slide. Who in this room is a veteran? Who in this room is a military spouse? Only 3 here.
That's
4?
spouse.
What?
That's
No, remember? We said
Okay.
military spouse. Use my definition.
Okay.
So 4, 5, 6. Raise your hands again if you're a military spouse. Thank you. Okay. So you have a perspective on serving this community that no one else has. And we're going to talk about being seated at the table in this conversation. But your seat at the table is an important voice to represent. And I think it's also important, I want to call this out too. I was speaking to someone who said, I appreciate all, it was at a military family event. And she said, I really appreciate all of your service as military spouses. I am not a military spouse. I'm married to a veteran. I married him after his service. No, you're a military spouse. Because being a veteran, you carry something as a veteran. You are impacted, you are changed for life because of your service. And so your spouse and your family, your children, they're changed too. Even if they weren't your spouse or your children when you were active duty. There are impacts on your family to being a veteran. You carry a weight with you. And your family deserves to know how to respond to that. That's an important part of our service delivery for military spouses and family members. So you are a military spouse. Thank you very much. Okay, veteran families. So there's a lot of similar impacts that actively serving military families have, that veteran families have. But there's also some distinctions. The first is loss of military connection through the installation. So some veterans are no longer eligible for service on installation. They're not retirees or in certain categories. They may not be able to get service on installation anymore. That is very jarring. It's jarring for the veteran, and it can be jarring for the family as well. You grow up or spend years in that environment. Lack of place. Many people live where they were born. You live somewhere by coincidence. You happen to be born there, so you stayed there. Well, the military moved us around so much that it's hard to have a sense of place. Where do you land when you can land anywhere? Where do you go when you can get out? Nobody's telling you anymore. The military made sure you didn't have roots. So where are you going to plant yourself? And that's hard for veterans. In 2019, when my husband got out, where do we go? We like Washington, but is this it? Should we stay here? Is there some other place that's waiting for us that we need to go to? My husband told me the other day that we are going to have lived in our house for 6 years. I'm coming close to 50, and I've never lived anywhere for 6 years before. I mean, this was shocking to me. This is, I think, my 23rd house. I've never lived anywhere for 6 years. And this is wild. I want to be buried in the backyard. I mean, honestly, it's just so completely foreign. Has anybody else lived anywhere for a long time? If you're a veteran family, does it feel strange to be somewhere and not leave it? It's very jarring. You want to stay, but then you're like, maybe I should go. I don't really know. I'm supposed to move every 2 to 3 years. You get this rhythm to yourself that you have to leave a place. And we don't talk about that enough. How unsettling it is not to have roots and not to be told where to go. And then when you are somewhere and you're happy, how weird that feels. And that's part of this conversion and being part of a veteran family. Veteran family members have service-connected impacts, but often are not eligible to or marketed for services from providers who have training with veterans. So what I mean is mental health providers, healthcare providers that focus on the veteran community and understand the impacts of traumatic brain injury or PTSD. They're focused on serving veterans, which is, they should be, and that's an important community to serve. But there's not a lot of service providers who are focused on serving spouses and family members who are living with service members and veterans who have those impacts. So that's an issue within our community as well. Lack of affordable housing and homelessness are impacts. Veterans, as I showed you on the demographic data, spouses and family members of veterans were not really tracked. There's a lot of us, but I don't really know exactly how many and where they live and how old they are. I know about the active duty people. The veteran population is a little bit more of a mystery from the family perspective. Many veteran families don't live with their sponsor, their veteran sponsor. And so that also creates a lot of issues and connection to service for the veteran and also for the child and the spouse. One of the things that is really important is that an entry pathway for services for veterans often is the child or the spouse. And so when they don't live together, that means sometimes veterans may not be getting the services that they need because their spouse isn't advocating for them like that. Caregiver roles, getting a lot more attention on this issue. Children that are providing caregiver support to parents, to veteran parents, and also spouses that are providing caregiver support. Sometimes it's not necessarily named. They're not part of a veteran community. It may be an invisible wound that you can't see, but yet the child is still needing to provide support. It could be as simple as the veteran is not comfortable grocery shopping. And so the child has to take on that responsibility because the veteran isn't comfortable going into public places. But those are still caregiver roles that children are having to perform. So recognizing that that's an issue for this population. And we talked about feeling disconnected from installation services, but yes, veterans also feel disconnected from civilian services and civilian communities. That's one of the top issues that veterans name, is that they just don't feel that the civilian community understands them, values them, sees them, knows them. They don't feel connected. So if you're not connected to the installation, and you're not connected to the civilian community, where are you finding community? Where are you finding help and support? Financial insecurity and basic needs continue to be issues for the veteran population and their families. Healthcare affordability is one of the top issues that veterans name for concerns. I talked about veteran spouses being an entry point for veterans for services. Again, the veteran population is reluctant to ask for help. It's part of their training and that culture within the military space that impacts the veteran population and family as well. Spouse underemployment and unemployment in the active duty and actively serving population impacts job seeking for veteran spouses. If you've had very disruptive work history as a military spouse of an active duty service member, that's going to carry over to your employability as a veteran spouse. And then veteran spouses, just like active duty spouses, are a diverse group that need multi-dimensional engagement to be able to serve them. Their thing that they have in common, just like actively serving spouses, is that they married someone who served. They married someone who is now a veteran. And that's about it. Other than that, they're very diverse. And so you cannot have one approach to serve them or to communicate with them. So at this point in the conversation, a lot of the time people will say, well, military spouses didn't serve. So I serve veterans who actually served our country. So I added this slide because I think that this is important. The Society for Human Resource Management with Psych Armor created a variety of trainings that are free, focused on serving veterans, military children, and military spouses. And they conducted a survey across a lot of different veteran populations, asking them, what are the things that you want the community to know? And from that survey, they created a top 15 list from the veteran community. Number 13, our families serve with us. So somebody ever says, well, military spouses or military families, they didn't serve, they didn't put on the uniform. Well, veterans say our families serve with us. So veterans want their families to have program service. They want their families to be served by different program supports and different functions like this. It's important to the veteran. And when we serve the family and the spouse, we are serving the veteran. And that's an important consideration. So if you have a program that services military spouses or military family members, a lot of the time it feels like there's not training on this topic. So these slides are going to be available to you. These are some of the best resource providers on serving military, for service providers, on how you can better serve military children and military spouses. So you'll be able to access this slide. There's a link. All these trainings are free, and they focus on families, and they also focus on veterans or on serving the active duty population or the actively serving population. And I just really think that this is a great entry point for being able to be service providers to this population. The one thing I will say here is, as a service provider, if I have a veteran, the first place I'm going to start is the Washington State Department of Veterans Affairs. If they're a transitioning service member preparing for their next step as a veteran or a veteran family, or if they're currently a veteran or veteran family. So starting with WDVA. If they are actively serving, they're active duty, or they're part of the selected reserve population, the best place to start for resource support is going to be the military. because the military has a variety of resource supports specific to this population. And that may not be the place to end for resource support, but it's the place to start. And the DoD has done a really good job on creating training and access for service providers that are outside of DoD and outside of the military. They're really starting to recognize that state agencies and nonprofits and other organizations are filling this need gap for the service member community. So Mill Life Learning, that's a DoD program on how to train service providers like yourselves to better serve this population. And then there is, the Military One Source has a program called Spouse Education and Career Opportunities. There is a section of that that's for service providers for this population, so you can train yourself on how to serve them. And then Military One Source has what's called Mill Provider. It's kind of for your phone. So if you're serving the military population, the actively serving military population, you can actually download this DoD app for providers, and you can use your phone to find the best resources. So there's a lot of new recognition in the community on how can we be more collaborative in our approach and help train, because DoD can't do it all. There's a lot of people. In Washington State in the past 20 years, our military population has grown 25%. Significant. So we all have to really step in and do this work. And it's great that DoD is recognizing it. Questions? Thoughts? Who here provides service in your program delivery to military spouses right now?
WorkSource does.
Yeah.
Really commit.
Yeah. What about military children? Yeah.
Specifically, there's a big need.
Yeah. What work source are you with?
I'm in Linwood.
Okay. Right here.
Yeah.
You guys got the JCSG award, and that's it. I love that. Very cool. Congratulations. There's two other resources that I like to mention to providers. They're also favorites of mine that I've taken myself. One is Discover the Talent through Hiring Our Heroes. It helps train people on workforce development for the military spouse community. It's about a 10-hour training. So I don't work for them, but I just want to tell you all the best things that I know that are available to you. And then the other I mentioned earlier is the Society for Human Resource Management. They have partnered with Psych Armor on a program called the Veterans at Work Certificate. It's maybe a little bit more than 10 hours of training, but it's free training. You do it through Psych Armor. It's called Veterans at Work. I'm going to talk about why that's problematic in a minute. But it includes military spouses in the training, and it also is one of the best programs. If you're in workforce development for military spouses or veterans, this is a great program. If you engage with the veteran or military community or the military spouse community in your work environment, not necessarily from a workforce development perspective, but just engaging with them, this is also a really good training tool. Okay, so before we move on, I want to ask, what do you consider in your program a military spouse? So who works at WorkSource? In the very back, like blue shirt on, what do you consider a military spouse at work in your program delivery?
Well, primarily from the JVSG program, I mean, they have to qualify because the service member has to have certain qualifying factors that maybe not necessarily the spouse will. So it's only when it's kind of a weird place, because I try to encourage everyone on our team, because not only is our veteran team serving veterans and qualifying spouses, but we're also serving active duty in the active duty community. So the entirety of our WorkSource team, we're all a veteran team. Mm-hmm. So we all work together very closely to ensure, to recognize that community and to work with them in any capacity that we can.
And I refer a lot of military spouses to WorkSource, because even if they're not on the the DBOB, DBER, JBSG. There's so many acronyms, I'm going to mess that up. But the general population, a military spouse would qualify just as general population civilian if they don't meet the requirements for the other categories. Can somebody correct me if that's wrong? Is that wrong?
No, it's not.
It's not wrong. Okay. Okay, so
we miss a lot of the military spouse because there's not we fill out the military form,
the intake.
but we don't ask specifically when a female comes in, are you a military spouse? And I think there's a big missing market there. And I don't mean market, I should say market, but no one's asking me if I was a military spouse when I hired in.
Yeah.
You know, we were in for 4 years, but no one's asked me that.
Yes.
You know.
So glad you bring that up. Yeah, segue into that. So marketing, but I'm going to get to the ask part, but marketing to military spouses and family members is super important. So we talked at the very beginning about understanding the culture, understanding the population. So when you're marketing to the population, you have to define what you're marketing. So how do you serve them? Are military spouses eligible? Yes, they are. Because if they're not eligible for program delivery, they can come in as a civilian. But how you have to understand your eligibility requirements so you can refer people to your program. And then unfortunately, you got to be well versed if you're doing this work in everybody else's program requirements and how they define a military spouse or a military child or a veteran so that you can refer out appropriately. So you got to understand what you're doing and how military spouses fit, and then your tertiary resources that you can refer to and what their requirements are. Your program eligibility requirements for a military spouse may not be the same as another service provider. I mean, they should be the same for all the workforce people from one office to the next, but for another organization, so Hiring Our Heroes, you might refer someone to Hiring Our Heroes. They have different program eligibility requirements than WorkSource does. So to really do this job effectively, whether you're in workforce and career development or not, you need to know what the requirements are. Be very clear who is eligible and what do they need to show to verify eligibility. Do they need a marriage certificate? Do they need a military ID? What do they need so that you can communicate that, so that they don't get there and have that shame? It's hard enough to ask for help. We know, we've identified that that is a problem in this community. So if they're going to take the step to come to you, make sure that you're communicating clearly on eligibility and what they need to verify. So inclusive terms. Hopefully you've caught me saying service member a lot. Service member is 2 words. This is my thing that I like to make sure people know. It is 2 words. Airmen, guardsmen, we want to say service member as much as possible. It's a more inclusive term. It makes all the branches feel included, and it's just more gender inclusive. So service member. And then spouses versus gender specific terms. So I'm the military spouse liaison, I'm not the military wife liaison, right? That's an important thing. There is a large percentage of female military spouses. That's true, but we are not exclusive to being female, and we want to be welcoming to all the military spouses that need help. And there are people that are not female that can require that assistance. And I'm not going to say what the other term is, but I'm sure you know for military children. I grew up as a military child. Every time I say that, people say it. So I'm not going to say it. But if you want to be welcoming to military children, you're not going to say the term that people like to say about military children. Because that's not a nice word. So just don't say that word. And I know it's funny. But if you want to have program delivery, and if you don't know the word I'm talking, go talk to your people that attended afterwards and they can tell you. But it's a military child, say military kid. Trying to get away from the terms. If you want to create welcoming language, if you want to market and communicate to the population, use the right words. Start there. So, part of this is the word dependent. In the military, we're dependents of our service member. In the veteran space, ways sometimes we're dependents of our service member for healthcare and for other sponsor kind of related things. I really try to use the term service member sponsor versus military dependents. Try to flip it. It's just nice to not be considered a dependent, especially when you're seeking services or program delivery for yourself. So if you can avoid that language, that's great. You are not the Department of Defense. You are not the Veterans Administration. You are different agencies. You are different program deliverables. So dependent doesn't necessarily fall into what you need to be communicating. Maybe part of your eligibility. Oh, look, there's even a slide for it. So just be cautious. I know that it has to come up sometimes, but to be more welcoming and inclusive, we want to avoid it. And then the drop-down menu. So one of my favorite resources is through the Department of Labor for military spouses. And it is called TEAMS. Oh gosh, I can't remember what TEAMS is an acronym for, but of course it's an acronym. And it's one of the best ways for military spouses to become educated on career development issues. There's just amazing training topics. However, the Department of Labor, to reach TEAMS, as a military spouse, I have to click Veterans, go down to the bottom of the drop-down and find military spouse. Most military spouses are not going to click Veterans. They're just not, because they're not a veteran. So if you want to get in touch with military spouses, you can't make it so they have to click Veteran, because they just won't do it. They're not trying to be difficult, they're not trying to annoy you, but they're not veterans. And so if you have any kind of, if you can go back and impact how people are reaching your program or service, go back and look at it. Go back whenever you go back to your offices. Check it out. WorkSource is not one of my examples here. Do not worry. But that's an important consideration. How are they having to find you? Because if they have to find you by clicking veteran, most military spouses do not identify as a veteran. So this is my example of one of my favorite resources, but it's underutilized because it's the drop-down on veterans and it's the very last thing for them to find. And then demographics and eligibility. So hiring our heroes. Also one of my very favorite resources for the military spouse, veteran, and transitioning service member community. For this program, this is the Military Spouse Professional Network Program. Amazing resource. This program is open to past and present military spouses or significant others. Are you a military spouse or a significant other to a military service member? Well, I am not a military spouse to a military service member. I'm a military spouse to a veteran. So I'm going to click no because I'm not. That's not correct. I am disqualified now. Thank you for your interest. We are open to past, specifically for military spouses or significant others, past and present. We encourage you to explore our other programs at Hiring Our Heroes. And I'm not doing this to be mean to Hiring Our Heroes. I love Hiring Our Heroes. You can't find a better advocate for them. This is an example of most program delivery for military spouses. When you register for the program, the people that created the registration were not military spouses, and so probably, and they made it so that I was not eligible, even though I should be. So check your drop-downs, check your sign-up forms, check your eligibility forms, check how people connect with your program, because you can make it so that people are having to remove themselves. You're making them leave. This happens with frequently with veterans, veteran spouses, where that won't be an option on the drop-down. Happens with Gold Star spouses. I've engaged with organizations that say, just have them click that they're still serving. No. I'm not going to tell a Gold Star spouse to put that their service member is still alive. That's not going to work. So you have to check how this is getting communicated and how your population signs up. And also, ... spouses. If your program, so sometimes programs will want to have a few more people come. or they'll want to show that they invited military spouses, but they didn't want to welcome them. They just wanted to include them. And also military spouses is a really big problem in our service delivery industry. And what that means is you just added military spouses to the people who could come, but you didn't do anything to welcome military spouses. So what welcomes a military spouse? Well, what would welcome a civilian? Because military spouses are basically civilians. Is everybody in uniform? Is everyone wearing a uniform at this event? Because if they are, maybe military spouses are not going to feel comfortable. Is it all acronyms? Are you defining what the acronyms are? Are you talking about MOSs? Is the workshop about the crosswalk? That's not helpful to a military spouse. They don't need to know how to translate their military experience into civilian terms. They were never in the military. So what did you do to make it be not allowed, but welcome? What did you do for your program? Let's see. So other things, is the environment military spouse friendly? Is military or veteran spouse an option for self-identification? Is military spouse located at the top of the eligibility checklist? Is it veteran and then every other possible kind of person? Veteran, alien, I don't know, any other kind of thing that you could be. And then at the bottom is military spouse. Because, it's not just on the bottom. We feel that. Military spouses know when it's an afterthought. We're aware. It's obvious. We have been showing up and being dependent and second and extra and an add-on the whole time. Our whole lives are that way. I know my husband's social security number better than I know my own. I'm always the second in that environment. So if you want to serve me and the military spouse community, make me first. Or make me right under the veteran. Not the very, very last consideration. Did a military spouse vet the content and participate in the planning of your program delivery and your communication? You're trying to serve military spouses, ask a military spouse. And this is going to be controversial, but don't ask a veteran who is also a military spouse. You can never take off the veteran hat. Really, really hard. I am not a veteran. And so my advocacy for military spouses, I don't have to remove a veteran hat. How impossible is it to remove a veteran hat? When you're serving the veteran community, you cannot take off the veteran hat. You're always going to be a veteran first. And I don't think that's fair to ask someone, look at it through a veteran lens. Oh, take off your hat. Now look at it through a military spouse lens. Often, I will be in a room and someone will say, we have a military spouse here. They're checking all the boxes. They served also. And that's great, and I appreciate them for being there. But it's a different perspective when you see it through the lens of military spouse. Have the dual military affiliation person there also. They bring a different voice. Dual military is not represented enough. Make sure somebody that's a military spouse vets the content. Time of day programming. Most military spouses can't find childcare. So either let them bring their kids or have it at different times of the day because it's really, really hard. And I know that's hard for program delivery people to work at night or work on the weekends. I get that. But we got to figure it out. We have to figure out how to serve this population so that they can have somebody watch their kids. If you don't have childcare, you don't have a slot at the Child Development Center, you can't go to these things. You're missing the opportunities. I said it, is everybody in uniform? No acronyms or reduce the acronyms. Military spouses don't have a shared work history, training experience, uniform requirements. They're obviously diverse, we talked about that. How would you adjust your program or content to appeal to civilians? And it's really hard to think of military spouses as being civilians because they're military connected. But the reality is, we're civilians. You married somebody that's in the military. I'm not in the military. I don't wear my husband's rank. I didn't have any training. I consistently remember what insignia means or what the ranks are. And I'm kind of proud of that. I'm not in the military. I represent people who did not serve in the military primarily. And so if everything is connected to rank and uniform and that culture, that's very challenging for military spouses. So marketing, getting the word out. I hear often, well, we had a program, nobody came. We have to promote where they are. So the number one way to reach a military spouse is by talking to a military spouse. They use word of mouth and referral as their top way to find out information. They crowdsource, to be honest, I think they crowdsource too much. I'm in all of the Facebook pages for our military spouse communities across the state of Washington. And the number one thing they crowdsource is how to get their license tabs. I'm like, please don't crowdsource this, you're not gonna get good information. But they are crowdsourcers, and I believe that they crowdsource information as a way to connect whenever they arrive in the community. It's just a way to kind of build friends and make kind of connections with each other to make friends when you're new in town. So if word of mouth and referral are primary ways to get the word out. Social media, those private unofficial groups for the installations or the veteran communities for the spouses are major ways to talk about your program delivery and events that you have going on. Military customers and employees. So if you've served a military spouse, talk about that. Put that person, take a picture of that person and say, oh, at WorkSource in Linwood, look at the military spouse that we served. Here's her story as a military spouse. Here's the job that she got because she came here. If you're a military spouse, contact us. We can help you get a job. Yes?
Can I say one thing to your, not just on Veterans Day promotion?
Yes.
The worst time that you can do promotion for what you're talking about and what most of the rest of us are doing is 4th of July, Veterans Day, Memorial Day.
Yes.
I mean, if you're doing something around those times, there's so many other things or programs for veterans and veterans' families. That's terrible, and I see it. I mean, we're out there, oh, we're going to have something
Around and those
Veterans Day.
Very specific military holidays.
Yeah.
I think I have a list of that somewhere.
Yeah.
But that's a really
Armed Forces Day.
Here,
Yeah.
I have a whole holiday list.
Yeah, Armed Forces Day. Yeah.
And Peter is so right. Veterans Day and also May is Military Appreciation Month. There's so much fatigue for events in those months. But I will say, the military community really likes to honor their service branch birthdays. They really, really like to talk about their service branch birthdays. So that would be, if you're looking for a month or kind of a celebration purposeful, you're near an installation and you're near a Navy base or you're near an Air Force base in Spokane or Linwood, you have Naval Station Everett or the Coast Guard, I guess, in Seattle. Those would be good holidays. It's a little bit off for what the other businesses are doing, and the installation nearby really likes to talk about the birthdays. Let's see, utilizing military customers, engaging on installation, you have access to the installations. There's hiring fairs, and you might think, well, that's a hiring fair. I'm not in career services or development. Hiring fairs, though, lots of people come. So if you can get yourself as a resource provider at a hiring event and have a table, then you can get your word and your mission out about whatever it is you're doing. So there's ways to get on installation, other events that they have. They have marketing that they allow other organizations to be on site. Economic Community Development Organizations, WDBA, we have work groups and communities of practice within our agency. Collaborate with organizations that serve the military community. Red Cross puts on a bunch of events. If you're trying to reach military spouses, you should probably talk to Operation Homefront whenever they're doing a backpack distribution. Get on site there, or have your team there volunteering with your shirts on or something. That's a good way because that's a group of these people that you're trying to connect with. And then obviously membership-based veterans organizations. If you have some kind of program where you're looking for volunteers, and I don't think, well, a couple of you in this room do, but asking military-connected volunteers to serve again some people struggle with that if they're looking for volunteers. In my experience, the best way for veterans, active duty, and spouses and children to connect and deep dive and make a network in a community is by volunteering. So if you have volunteer opportunities that are well suited for this population, don't feel like they've already served and you don't want to ask them again, because asking them is sometimes the best way to get them engaged. And there's a lot of work experience benefits to doing that as well. So a lot of this we talked about. What are the needs of military spouses? Obviously, unemployment and underemployment are primary needs. Childcare, housing affordability, basic needs security, and connecting to appropriate resources. We have a lot of nonprofit organizations conduct need-based survey assessments of the military community, the veteran community, and the spouse community. DoD does on some level as well. And this is a Blue Star family survey. If you are serving military spouses or military children or veterans, this is a good survey to have connection to. And in my slides, there's a link to it. This is just a screenshot from their top categories. The red is the top 5 for each of the categories. Active duty spouses, active duty service members, veteran spouses, veterans, National Guard families, and reserve families. So you can see consistently spouse employment, time away, children's education, relocation, and pay are top priorities. Child care is also a top priority. It's a little bit less for active duty spouses than for service members. I think that's pretty obvious why. Service members have a few other concerns veteran spouses have a few other concerns that pop up. Healthcare, understanding of the issues by civilians, mental health, physical health, and deployment impact on family. Deployment impact on family is 24% for active duty spouses, which is also, it's one of the top ones as well for concerns. I find it so interesting that veteran spouses say deployment impact on family is a top concern. They're not deploying. So they're seeing the impact of that after service. Yeah, do you have a question?
I do. Didn't directly relate to this, but are there incentives for employers in Washington State to hire spouses, military spouses, and military kids?
So no, we don't have an incentive for active or for children. There is proposed federal legislation that would potentially give a tax incentive to employers for military spouses. Most likely, if that were to happen and pass, it would be active duty. Veteran spouses would most likely be included, and probably not children. So there is not a tax incentive but we do have in the state of Washington Yes Vets, which is a program for businesses to sign up. It's free to sign up to commit to hiring veterans. While it's committing to hiring veterans, there is a lot of education and encouragement to hire military spouses as part of that program as well. So it's more communication and education campaigns around military spouse hiring. It's a really good question. There's also not protections for military spouses who disclose their military spouse affiliation. So they could potentially not be hired, or they could be maybe fired or eliminated because of their military spouse status. Yes, do you have a question?
I just wanted to kind of add to that is that there are a lot of state agencies that do seek dependents and spouses right now and actively, because they may be looking for temporary roles that are really fitted to like 2 to 3 year tours.
That's a really good point. State agencies within the state of Washington do have hiring. They have hiring, not preference, but encouragement to hire military spouses, and federal jobs do have military spouse preference for federal hiring jobs. So it's a complicated question. Virginia is the only state that's engaged with a protection for military spouses. We're really closely watching that because there's a potential of there being sort of backfiring of that legislation, maybe not, where military spouses disclose because they're protected, and then maybe still doesn't work out, and how do you prove that? So that has been within the last year that's been enacted, and really closely watching to see what happens. But good question. as an incentive, right? Yeah. Like that. So anyway, you can check out what these needs are. I don't think any of them are surprising with the exception of this deployment impact on family for the veteran community, which means that that deployment has kind of a longer term impact than you would initially think. I'm not going to go through these except to say that the Military Family Advisory Network is an amazing organization, and they also conduct significant research. And I've linked in my slides, which I've been told you'll be emailed. That's what they're going to email all the registrants. So if you're interested in looking at this, this really shows a lot of the concerns, loneliness, other hardships, issues with financial readiness, housing, food insecurity. Deep dive into some of the largest issues that our community is facing from active duty as well as veteran perspectives. We talk about, I was saying earlier about the amount of college education, unemployment, and how they're volunteering. This is really significant from an employment perspective and how it impacts military spouses. Being underemployed has far-reaching career consequences. You will feel the impact of being unemployed or underemployed as a military spouse in your whole career. Trends in veteran and military spouse unemployment, we have seen significant improvement in veteran unemployment numbers, but not in military spouse unemployment numbers. The moves just continue to have an impact, lack of incentives, lack of education for the employers, awareness campaigns where employers still think that if they hire a civilian, they're going to be with them for 10 years. That's not going to happen. 2 to 3 years still for the civilians. Just having to do a more work to educate the hiring workforce. You can see this is the unemployment rate, how it's just increased. It has not improved from 14% to that 22% number overall.
2022 numbers is at 39%.
Yeah, I actually haven't been incorporating that. And the reason I try not to say that number is because I think it's so COVID impacted that I think that it's going to dip down again. So I'm trying to use pre-COVID numbers, but you're right. 34% is what joining forces reported from the White House report last year, September of last year. Yeah.
If I may add to that, on GBLM, that's a large consequence because they don't have the staffing for child care solutions.
Right? Child care is really the start of the conversation. So if you don't have child care, you can't work. So part of it also is how many people are unemployed because they can't get a job, and how many are unemployed because they're not seeking employment because they can't get child care. So they're not even included in the percentage, which then, if it's 34% in the COVID numbers, what in the world would it be if we incorporated those not even seeking employment? I mean, the number just grows. So we talked about some of the challenges, veteran transition challenges versus military spouse challenges. These are the military spouse employment challenges are different than the veteran transition challenges. We have to address them separately, starting with child care, obviously, and then the frequent moves. This top point here is so important, and I want everyone to really lead with it. Veterans and military spouses are often included under the same hiring initiatives, but the business case, their skill set, strengths, and workplace preparedness may be different. So you cannot have a veteran hiring initiative or a veteran employee engagement initiative and say, and also military spouses. They just don't work the same. They don't have the same set of needs and issues. So what can you do? We're about to close out. Doing pretty good on time. So I have top 8 things. The first is ask the question. Most of you are in the veteran servicing industry, so you're already asking this question. Did you serve in the military, or are you part of a military family? If you say, are you a veteran, then you might lose veteran by saying that. So wording it this way, potentially, will help you connect with your veteran population as well as your military family population. Don't assume that all wounds are visible. There are invisible wounds. There are real injuries that impact spouses and family members. Those impacts can be far-reaching and have significant consequences. Families serve with their service member. veteran families are military-connected families and have been impacted by military service. And there's a range of how veterans identify with their military service and how strongly connected they are. You're in the veteran serving space, so you know that, but that also applies to military-connected families. Some of them feel very, very strongly identify as a military family. Others don't. So when you're trying to reach them and communicate with them, appeal to them, knowing that is important. We talked about resources for awareness of this culture and understanding of the community. If you really want to serve them, you have to learn about them, how you can best provide service. Our military spouse is seated at the table. So if you're making decisions, if you're starting a program, if you're building a communication piece, you need to make sure military spouses are engaged in the decision making, how the program looks, what the communication says, so that you're really connecting with them and really appealing to them. And then this last point is a challenge. It may be difficult, as we talked about, for this community to ask for help. Your program may be an entry point to other needed services for the spouse, child, service member, veteran. You may need to ask follow-up questions. I don't know what the situation will be, so I can't give them to you. But I can tell you that if you're servicing a veteran, a good question might be, do you have a family member that also needs service? Is there someone in your family that could use a resource as well? If you're servicing a spouse, you could say the same. Do you have a family member who also needs service? They may have a veteran that needs service. Recently, I had a military spouse reach out to me. She was struggling to find employment support. There's a lot of employment support in Washington. So what I've learned in the course of my work over the last year is that if a military spouse finds me because they need employment support, they probably don't need employment support. They probably need something else. And the last couple of weeks, that was the transitional, I'm going to forget the name right now, support services, I believe, through DOD, which if you are a victim of domestic abuse, the DOD has support services for you to extricate yourself from that situation and not lose income. And it's called transitional, which is a terrible name because transition is our term for leaving the military. So that's not what that means. But I had a couple of spouses in the last couple of weeks reach out to me saying they need employment support, but they didn't need employment support. They needed something else. And in talking to them, it became very clear what they did need, and that was to connect to this service. And I'm not a counselor. I am not a suicide peer support specialist, but I know those resources. And so in asking the questions, I can help them connect to those resources if necessary. Employment seems to be a good entryway to getting other things. And I know that in your work at work, many of you are with WorkSource. In your work at WorkSource, you are tied closely to other program deliverables. And so think of that as potentially from a veteran's perspective, entry to the family, and from the family perspective, entry to the veteran. And what services do they need? So now I tend to ask, is there anything else that you need from a resource perspective? Is there anything else I can help connect you to? Most of the time they say no, but sometimes they will say something very significant. It's a lot easier to come to someone to say, I need to find a job, when what you need is mental health care. So that is often the entry point. And please know that that's a big burden. And there was one of the sessions today was on empathy fatigue, and it's a lot to ask of people in your roles to be asking these questions. And I think that there's further conversation on that topic. But please ask that secondary question, that follow-up question. So we talked about where to start. We have on the Washington State Department of Veterans Affairs a career resource directory for military spouses. I'm super proud of it. I have a couple of copies up here, but it's meant to be digital, so you can get it online. And WorkSource is included in it. There's lots of WorkSource stuff in there. Veteran and Military Resources, WDDA, has a resource page that links by category to a bunch of different kinds of resources. So that's a great starting point also for veterans and military. So service members and their families, military one source. That's the starting point if they're actively serving. MilitaryChildcare.com for childcare, and then the Washington State Military Spouse Initiative, which is me. We have information on the DBA website as well. This is not comprehensive resources. It's just, I can't tell you the hundreds of resources for your community right now. So this is just a good place to start. And I think that's everything. Does anyone, I know I just talked so much, I really apologize, but I had 90 minutes to tell you everything I know in my brain. Does anyone have questions? Does anyone have any questions, thoughts, concerns, anything that you'd like to share? No? Okay. So there's a survey. You can take the survey. I will stay around if you want to come chat. I have some handouts that you are welcome to come and take, or my card as well. I know you want to get started driving. So thank you very much for staying with me till the end. I really appreciate all of it.